Let's look at the square root of 54. Since 54 is not a perfect square, we have to try and break that up into two numbers that multiply to give us 54, with one of the numbers being a perfect square. So, if you think of factors of 54, we can come up with 9 and 6. And since 9 is a perfect square, we should use these two numbers. So, 54 is going to break apart into the square root of 9 times the square root of 6. And since we know the square root of 9 is 3, we're going to write the 3 without a square root symbol. And since we don't know the square root of 6, we keep it inside the square root symbol. So the final answer for the square root of 54 is 3 times the square root of 6. Let's take a look at another example. 75 is not a perfect square, so let's look to break it up into two numbers, with one of the two numbers being a perfect square. If you think of the factors of 75, we have 25 and 3. So you can break up the square root of the square root of 75 into the square root of 25 times the square root of 3. And we know the square root of 25, it's 5. So we take that outside of the square root symbol. We don't know the square root of 3, so we leave it underneath the square root symbol. So our final answer for the square root of 75 will be 5 times the square root of 3. In this example, try to come up with the two numbers that can multiply to give you 600, with one of them being a perfect square. And hopefully you came up with 100 times 6. So, we have the square root of 100 times the square root of 6. And since the square root of 100 is 10, that comes outside of the square root symbol. And the square root of 6 is something that we don't know, so we leave it underneath the square root symbol. So the final answer would be 10 times the square root of 6. Okay, that rule is going to come into play when we look at this type of an example with variables. The square root of a to the 5th power. We don't know the square root of a to the 5th. We can break up a to the 5th power into perfect squares. So when we look to break it apart, we can say that that's the same as the square root of a squared times the square root of a squared times the square root of a. We've broken it apart and we do have 5 a's, but this is going to help to see these two right here, because from the rule we know that the square root and the squared symbol are going to cancel. So the square root of a squared is a. Over here the square root of a squared is a again. And we don't know the square root of a, so we leave it underneath the square root symbol. We can combine these two a's. A times a, we already know, is a squared. And since we don't know the square root of a, we just write it square root of a. So the final answer would be a squared times the square root of a.